Welcome to another episode of Planet Possible. We're delighted you're joining us to hear evidence-led discussion about topics that are critical to the way we manage our water and environment. And a huge thank you to our season sponsor, Atkins Realis, and you'll hear a little bit more about them later. We're really grateful for their support in bringing the pod to you. And if you're new to Planet Possible, I'm Nikki Roach. I'm a passionate advocate for all things water and environment, and I'm a proud fellow of CIWEM, which is the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. And CIWEM have got members in over 90 countries who are professionals with a breadth and depth of expertise in the topics that are really shaping the future of our planet, and we're joined by many of them across the season. So, in today's episode, we're exploring a topic that has been making the headlines here in the UK and is indicative of a wider conversation about the way we manage our water and wastewater in England and Wales. Thames Water, the largest water company in England and Wales, serving around 16 million customers, is hitting the headlines for both its environmental performance and its ability to fund the improvements regulators, customers and campaigners want to see. So today we're going to hear directly from both the campaigners and the company themselves. First up, we'll be joined by adventurer, TV presenter, author and campaigner Steve Backshall and the CEO of River Action, James Wallace, to hear their perspectives. And then we'll put their thoughts to Alex Nickson from Thames Water. But before we get into that, I'm joined by a Planet Possible regular and Director of Policy at CIWEM, Alex Chisholm, to help us navigate this topic. Welcome, Al.
Hi there, Nikki. Thanks for having me.
Let's start by understanding, just briefly, why is this topic so important?
This is a really important point in time. Within the next week, we are going to have a new government. And that new government may want to change things, maybe quite significantly, maybe minor tweaks around how water is managed. The next thing that is quite critical here is that we're going to have what's called the draft determination through from Ofwat on the next 5-year spending plans for the water industry. And this will be the first official view, really, on how much is going to be allowed to be spent by water companies on making improvements, including on the quality of the Thames. And I think when you set those things side by side, we just really need to understand how important this kind of issue is to the public, where they feel and where they really want to see things to change and how that change needs to come about.
Well, that's a great intro. Thank you. Let's get straight into the interview with Steve and James. James, Steve, welcome to Planet Possible.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
So, James, you've recently been sampling water in the River Thames. Tell me what you found.
Well, we've acquired some World Health Organization approved incubators, and inside you put a sample of 100 millilitres of river water. And we have been shocked to see that ahead of the boat race just a few months ago on the River Thames around the Hammersmith and Fulham area, that amounts about 10 times the worst level for bathing water status. So in other words, if you were to drink it, it would kill you. If you were to have it splash in your mouth when you're rowing, it could make you very sick. If it got into an open wound, like a blister, for example, or a gash on your leg or whatever, it could cause something like sepsis, which could result in hospitalisation or death. And then if we look upstream at places like Henley, we're seeing not as high, but we're seeing worrying levels.
And Steve, I know you live close to the Thames and you recently visited the local wastewater treatment works to understand a bit more about the discharges that are both permitted from the works and the storm overflows. What's your take on the sample results that James has just talked about?
Well, I did my own testing as well. I started off testing with James about 2 years ago now, but we were mostly focusing on nitrates and phosphates, and the levels were pretty shocking. But then I started doing my own testing with the University of Bangor's wastewater and wetland unit. So they're world specialists in this area. And I sent off my first set of results, and when they came back, the results were excruciating. There were levels of norovirus, enterovirus, of phages that only occur in the human gut that were tens of thousands the times that they should be in that water, and were actually higher than they would have expected from neat raw effluent. We've known about the problem with Thames Water and outages for a long time now, but I naively, like I think most people, assume that it's an unpleasantness, it's a bad smell, it's the possibility of swimming into a floater when you're on the river. I had no conception of quite the levels of contaminants. This is not just about poo floating down our river. This is about the possibility of a public health crisis in a time when already we know that the infrastructure is stretched to breaking point.
We know that there is a growing interest in the health of our rivers. Should our rivers be swimmable? What is it that you think is acceptable?
Yeah, so this river has been swimmable, very much so. I moved here to the riverside. I lived in a houseboat on the river while I built my dream home here. And I started off teaching my kids how to swim in this river. Now we have stand-up paddleboarders out on the river every single day. We have rowers, we have kayakers, canoers, sailors. We have people walking their dogs down by the riverside. People have come to realise that the Thames is improving, the Thames is getting better, and it's somewhere where we can go out and enjoy our leisure time. And then in the last 3 years, I would say, the frequency of these outages has increased dramatically, the amount of time that they're happening for, and all of a sudden it has just gone crashing back to way, way worse than it was before. It really feels to me like we have hit this turning point where the Thames was coming close to becoming the national jewel that it absolutely should be, and then we just filled it full of pathogens and contaminants. And the critical bit to me is that nobody was told. Thames Water absolutely knew this was happening. The sampling that I'm doing here, every couple of weeks, Thames Water had been doing every single day. And when I confronted them with the figures that I got and I asked them if they were surprised by it, they were like, well, no, of course not. We do sampling too. We know that this stuff's happening. But they haven't told anyone in the local area. They haven't said to people, you're out walking your dog who is knee deep in this substrate at the side of the river that is packed full of pathogens. That animal's going to get sick. They haven't said it. They've just kept quiet about it and said, well, nobody's told you can swim in the river, so why do you think you should?
I think what we're seeing here is a breakdown of regulation. Regulatory failure driven by austerity, by an ideal for a low regulatory environment from this government for the past 14 years. And dare I say, previous governments not paying enough attention to. And it means if you're a company like Thames Water, it means you can pollute with impunity. So what we need urgently is regulatory reform, a restructuring of Thames Water and being held in special administration measures.
Historically, we know that our infrastructure and our regulation has been focused on protecting the environment of our rivers. And we could question, as you did, Steve, how effectively water companies in general, and we're talking about Thames here specifically, have been doing that. But what's interesting for me is your statement, James, that rivers should be drinkable. And I'm really interested in exploring with you both whether there is an appetite to get to that level of quality, I suppose, really, because, as I said, historically, we've not thought about public health. We've thought about environmental health. That's why we've got consents for nitrates and phosphates and so on. But we don't have E. coli in our permits, typically, because the river can cope with a level of pathogens and we're not thinking about public health. The Royal Academy of Engineering put out a recent report, which I'm sure you've both seen, called Testing the Waters, which is fascinating. Chris Whitty chaired that piece of work. And there's a real focus on public health, which is the first time I've certainly heard us thinking about storm overflows from a public health perspective rather than an environmental health perspective. So who are rivers for? Is it the environment and nature, or is it people? Because to get us to those two places will require different levels of time and investment.
I think those two things are not an either or, they're connected. Is it for the environment and nature or people? It's for all of those things. This is a very new issue to an awful lot of people, and the overwhelming reaction has been, you what? Are you serious? They are constantly, over and over again, pouring raw sewage into the sea, into our rivers, now, in 2024, in, one of the most supposedly developed nations in the world. That is a cause of national shame. It is a giant scandal, and most people are just in absolute disbelief about it. And yes, you're right, a waterway of this size can dilute a certain degree of E. coli, but it can't dilute the amount that is being flushed out regularly from these outages and these sources. And what I found from my most recent testing, I've been doing testing that has happened, a month after the last outage, and the water is starting to clear up, but the sediment is not. The substrate at the bottom of the river and at the side of the river is still laden with all those viruses and bacteria, and people are getting sick. I've had a deluge of emails and Instagram messages from people who were in the Windsor Triathlon who, having done the swim in the River Thames, as they've been doing for years and years and years, and are violently, violently ill. We should not be living in a nation where that is possible.
Who are rivers for? They're for everyone. And when it comes to the general public's awareness of the problem, most people understandably will be thinking about spills and combined sewage overflows, which is totally understandable because, of course, you've got untreated sewage. But what people don't realise is that there is no requirement for tertiary treatment. So the reason, as you said, Nikki, that there is not monitoring of E. coli and there's not a requirement in permits is because there is not a requirement in law to have tertiary treatment. But what we'd like to see, surely, is a requirement in these permits for government to say the water should be, the final effluent should be treated to a high enough level not to make people sick and not to cause damage to wildlife. That's got to be a bare minimum, surely.
Yeah, interesting. So seeing microbiological parameters, if you like, in environmental permits, as well as the nutrient ones that we're starting to see as a starter. What you are painting a very clear picture of, both of you, is how complicated it is. Steve, you're obviously a broadcaster. You've got tons of experience in communicating the complexities of the natural world with the public. This debate has really caught the imagination. We are having people now across the whole breadth of society wanting and expecting more from our rivers. The water companies have got a role, as we've talked about. There's also a role for changes to agriculture, changes to highways, changes to our own behaviours. You know, the things that we choose to put down our toilets and into our drains plays part of this. How do we harness the passion that we're starting to see and the energy and convert it into something positive?
Yeah, that's the bit that I'm really wrestling with at the moment, because obviously my sort of knee-jerk reaction as soon as I started receiving back results that were horrifying was, well, we've got to get this message out there. We've got to educate people. We've got to let people know the things that Thames Water are not saying about what's going into the water right now. But then my next crisis is, what next? What happens now? I'm doing these tests as often as I can, but they are labour and financially intensive. That's not our job to do that. And also, critically, you know, I'm starting to get now a barrage of messages from local sailing clubs, from local triathlon clubs, and from businesses that set up during the pandemic to try and make use of the river, saying, well, when can we go back? When is it safe? We're losing business. What do we do for our customers? And frankly, if I was to step into that area, then I leave myself open to all sorts of litigation and issues and responsibility. It's an impossible situation, made worse by the fact that I've spent my entire adult life trying to convince mostly young people to get outside, to be more active, to be more adventurous, and to embrace nature more. And I want to continue that message. I want to be able to say to people, yes, the Thames is here and we have this extraordinary wildlife. And it is not the dirty river that it was when I was a kid. Far from it. It's this beautiful natural playground full of fish, full of wildlife. Get out there, enjoy it. Give yourself a great boost for your mental health in doing that. And I can't. You know, I don't have a set of results yet that can allow me to encourage anyone to get back into that river. Far from it. So I don't know is the answer. And I'm so lucky to have hooked up with people like James, who are beginning to create this network where we can use citizen science and we can use a gathering of far more voices, opinions, and sets of results to try and figure out what the hell we do next, because frankly, it is beyond my pay grade.
And this is one of the great frustrations that I have with this country, and it applies across the whole of Britain and the UK generally, is there's not enough collegiate behaviour that we need. When will we see all the 9 big water companies and their chief executives get together with people like us to be able to acknowledge the problem and work together towards common solutions? And when will we see a government actually open up, fess up as it were, own the problem, invest in it, cut back on this ridiculous deregulation scenario that we've seen happen for years now, and prioritise this problem?
Do you think that customers, ultimately, and citizens, are willing to pay for the environment that you've just described?
I think a lot has to happen first. If we have an acknowledgement that the law has been broken, that, for example, Ofwat has allowed investors to, frankly, rape and pillage the water sector, to indebt themselves to such an extreme level, and this has all been allowed to happen by the government through Ofwat. That has to happen first, doesn't it? Surely. There needs to be that recognition of the problem. And then companies like Thames Water, as I mentioned earlier, should be put in special administration and restructured so that the finance that they use is cost effective. So rather than these bonds that are carrying a sort of 8-9% return, have another form, for example, government issue bonds that are literally half that or less, where when prices are increased, that they are done after that there is an act of goodwill and, dare I say it, not generosity because it's making up for amends, but that happens first. Now, one of the toughest things that the water industry bosses and the regulators are going to have after this current price review is to sell the principle of increasing bills, having run to the hills with our money. And just to remind you, listeners, watchers, Steve and I are both customers of Thames Water. They have run off with our money and they have not invested even in maintaining a standard, let alone improving it. And that has been demonstrated again and again by the issues of pollution. So why should we pay when investors have run off with our money? So there needs to be a mechanism, not necessarily where things are clawed back. I don't want money back. What I want to see is that the problems are fixed. And that means a financing mechanism that puts people and planet before profit, and that only after an environmental standard has been met, that things like dividend and interest payments can be met.
There has been nothing that I have done in my 25 years in television, including, I should say, Strictly Come Dancing, that has had more people coming up to me on the street. It seems to be one of those very few subjects that everyone who hears it goes, yes, of course. We are a nation that has ideas of grandeur. We want to be able to sit on a global stage alongside the big players. Well, to be able to do that, you've got to have the very, very basic things sorted first, and that is the quality of our air, of our soil, and of our water. And if we don't have those things, everything else is just a complete waste of time. And I think that people do get that. There's a real sense that this is one of those very few issues that now, in our increasingly polarised tribal society, has united people across the board.
With the water companies, as we know, they are self-regulating. They are monitoring their own or marking their own homework. That is not a good idea for obvious reasons. If they then don't have enforcement above that, then it will be tempting to not monitor accurately. And then when the Environment Agency, for example, is notified of a Category 1 or 2 pollution incident, they very, very, very rarely turn up. What is more important than food, farming, water, and the environment? I mean, it underpins and enables every single thing in our lives. So it's about time that when it comes to water companies, a proper marking of homework done by the regulator. Imagine that, where they actually inspect without giving warning and they try and not catch them out. No one wants to see anyone fail. We want to see them succeed. And the same with farmers too. To make sure those inspections happen, make sure that the data that's coming through is trustworthy, and that when that monitoring is done, the data is then used for enforcement activities, and that when fines are levied, they are instant or as close to instant as it can be, and not have to go through criminal courts and so on. So there's some really, really basic, obvious stuff. But above all that, if we could have a very clear and simple, transparent ownership structure for water companies like Thames Water, where people and planet are put before profits, I think that would have a really good step, and it won't happen without some reform of the regulators.
I think the one criticism that we do get is that there's a sense of NIMBYism about it. There's a sense of privilege. There's a sense of, well, just because you have a nice house on the river, you're all upset about the fact that, but, I moved to the river because I love it. People move to the coast and to the sea because it calms them and they adore its beauty, and it is something in their life that they desperately want. And we're the people that see those changes over time. I've only lived by this river for 10 years, but I've been kayaking it for 25. And I know when one single family of water birds has their brood fail because the gulls come in and take the eggs. And all of a sudden, I'm seeing everything fail. I'm seeing fish floating at the surface and water birds disappearing. The stench of, if not effluent, then of surfactants and detergents in the water, where I know that there are otters swimming at night and I know the kingfishers are feeding. It hurts, it stings. I've made a conscious effort to move my entire life here because I love it. I'm invested in it and I want to see it back to where it should be.
I'm going to ask you both one final question, and I'm going to pass you both the Planet Possible magic wand. Give it a wave. If you could make one thing possible with that magic wand, what would it be? Steve, I'll come to you first.
To be able to go back to the dream of teaching my kids to swim in this river, to allowing them to snorkel, as I have done, up and down the banks, in the reeds, looking for pike and perch, and enjoying it as something wild and wonderful that we should all treasure.
And in order for us to get there, my magic wand would be waved a few minutes before, and that would be to enable us all to behave like we are in an emergency, because we are.
Our 2024 season of Planet Possible is supported by one of the leading engineering and design consultancies in the world, AtkinsRéalis. Here at Planet Possible, we bring a diverse range of voices from across the international water and environment sector to explore how to tackle some of the biggest challenges we face. And that aligns perfectly with the AtkinsRéalis purpose of engineering a better future for our planet and its people. We're really grateful to AtkinsRéalis for enabling us to bring another exciting year of Planet Possible to you. Okay, so we've heard from Steve and James from a campaigner's perspective. So now we're joined by Alex Nickson, who's the head of environmental compliance, partnerships and catchment management at Thames Water. And Alex's role involves ensuring that Thames is compliant with environmental regulations, and he works with partners to identify, co-create and co-deliver solutions to their shared challenges. And I should just say that Alex recorded this in an office environment, so you might be able to hear a little bit of background noise. Hi Alex, a very warm welcome to Planet Possible. I'm glad you could join us.
Nikki, hello. Pleasure to be here.
So you've just heard the interview with Steve Backshall and James Wallace. Tell me your initial thoughts.
It was very interesting, but I think there's sort of three public myths I'd like to start off by busting. These are issues that James and Steve repeatedly come back to in their interview, and I think we need to air these, because otherwise we'll keep discussing around these subjects. So the first one is that we do not care. I have circa 8,000 colleagues that come to work every day at all hours of the day to provide clean and wastewater services to our nearly 16 million customers. Most of these colleagues live in the Thames Water area. We are members of the same communities as James and Steve. We are dog walkers, anglers, bird watchers, paddleboarders, wild swimmers, or we have friends and family that are. So, we share the passion for the environment that inspired James and Steve. We are open and transparent about our actions and our data. For example, we were the first company ahead of any direction to do so, to publicly share our data on storm overflows. This is on our website and provides near real-time map data so members of the public can make informed decisions about entering our rivers. We also have 253 self-designated sites of biodiversity interest with specific management plans for them, and that covers up to about 4,000 hectares of land. So, we really passionately care about the environment in which we operate. The second myth is that we are somehow solely responsible for river water quality. James and Steve both touched on the range of factors that others contribute to the state of our rivers, and it's important that we make that distinction between river environmental health and river water quality for public health, though there is a significant overlap between the two. To exemplify that, the EA looked into the reasons for rivers not achieving good ecological status. And in their assessment, the water sector is responsible for approximately 31% of the contributing negative factors. So whilst this is the greatest single contribution for any sector, it means that nearly 70% comes from other sectors, principally agriculture, urban and transport runoff. So if we put nothing into rivers, we would still have 70% of that problem. The Rivers Trust also looked at this, and they compared the state of rivers in 2021 against their 2024, and they didn't identify the crash that Steve referred to. I think one area that we can all agree on is that public health and river water quality, there is a gap in leadership and knowledge. This ultimately stems from the fact that until recently, this has not been an issue of major public concern. This has led to a poor evidence base on the sources of bacteria, their relative contribution to public health, and limited science of bacterial levels in river. An example we could give is we've been doing sampling of river water quality in Henley every other day at either end of the famous regatta mile since the middle of May. And we've been analysing the levels of two different bacteria, E. coli and intestinal enterococci, which are used as indicators by the EA in order to make their classifications of designating bathing waters. So for a whole of that period, on only 3 days have we observed bacterial counts higher than the threshold for good bathing water quality status. And whilst these appear to correlate with heavy rainfall days, none of our nearby storm overflows have operated during that period, which really points to the fact that there are other factors or sources that are driving this increase in bacterial levels. And I think it's important to remember also that, rivers are natural environments. They are not sterile, and important to have that thriving ecosystem in order to have that rich diversity of wildlife. Neither Steve nor James mentioned how significantly wet this winter has been. We've had the wettest winter in 24 years, the 8th wettest winter since records began over 200 years ago. And the intensity of that rainfall and the prolonged duration of that rainfall have meant that groundwater levels have been very, very high, and also that inundation from stormwater getting into our drains and sewers has put an enormous demand upon our sewage treatment works. And that has partially accounted for the high levels of spills that we've seen this winter. The third bit I want to bust is that we put shareholders over profits, the people over planet that they refer to a number of times. Our shareholders have not taken an external dividend since 2017, and our business plan for the 2025 to 2030 period assumes that no external dividends to shareholders until at least 2030 to support turnaround and investment in our company.
Okay, so you've busted a few myths, and that's great. And it's good to start with that, I think, really, and to get some of that out. But you heard some really big challenges from Steve and James. One in particular I thought was interesting was Steve talked about a reduction in quality on the bit of Thames he lives alongside over the last 3 years. And I wondered specifically, is that something that Thames Water are aware of, or whether there's anything you wanted to respond to in relation to that?
It's certainly not something that we've seen, and it's not something that's coming through strongly from a wide diversity of recreation groups and environmental groups. And I think it's borne out by the River Trust State of Our Rivers report. They'd compared river health from 2021 to 2024 for England, and they said that whilst river quality had not improved, there was certainly no reference to the crash that Steve has observed. And again, it would come back to what indicators are we looking at to determine that river health. So that may be his personal experience, but it's certainly not something that we're seeing borne out in the information available to us.
So Steve certainly talked about, with some passion, didn't he really, the absurdity of the fact that we're talking about sanitation in these terms. From your perspective, we think back to where we used to be 150 years ago and where we are now, but we're still having these kind of conversations, which can feel a bit crazy, really. Have you got a sense from Thames Water's perspective of how we've got to this point in the conversation?
I think my feeling is that river water quality in terms of public health has not been the issue that it is until now. There is always more that we need to do than we have money available. We need to replace lead pipes, we need to fix the leaks, we need to improve the environment, and we consult with our customers on their priorities for our business plans. And it is really only since the COVID lockdown that we've really seen this very strong demand for improvements in bathing water quality. In some areas, it's a very sort of discrete areas by very localized groups. We totally hear what they're saying, but there's a large amount of other priorities that we need to fund and a balance that we need to strike between sort of the affordability of our bills, the deliverability of what we can achieve, and the impact that we need to be having. And some of it also comes back to the fact that we are not the only contributors to poor water quality, and it seems to me that there is an absence in the debate of leadership and good science. As I referred to the Henley example, we see some of the worst water quality on days where we were not spilling to the river. So others need to get involved in this.
You talk about an absence of leadership and good science, and actually that's something that we heard James and Steve talk about, wasn't it? They talked about the need for more leadership. I'm really interested in just digging into that a little bit more with you in terms of where you think that leadership is lacking, or maybe a more positive way of looking at that is where would we want to see that leadership coming from and that good science, I suppose, really?
I think the key problem is that we need to have a champion for the river, an agency championing the environmental quality and river water quality in rivers. Logically, the Environment Agency is the best placed agency to do that, but they are not funded to do it. They are very clear that their funding extends only to areas designated as bathing water quality. But really, they need to be the voice for the other contributors to this and bringing those partners to the table, so the agriculture and the urban and transport runoff. We need to have more science on river water quality for public health. We need to be understanding how bacteria breed, thrive, survive and die in rivers and what conditions cause them to do so. Because we are leaning into this debate. We recognise that we have a critical role to play into it, but we do feel rather isolated. We do feel rather alone at the top, and it would lead to a much more healthy and balanced debate, a better identification of solutions if those other people could come to the table.
That's really clear, and I think a point of agreement between yourselves and Steve and James. Actually, I think we heard them say similar things, didn't we, in many senses?
Absolutely. I mean, they are absolutely right that we need to be having all those partners round the table, working together, sharing data and sharing investment, because I also think that we can co-create and co-deliver much better solutions when we work together. We have a program called Smarter Water Catchments, where we're working with river communities in 3 rivers, the Chess, the Evenlode and the Colne, and we're doing fantastic things there. We are really identifying great green solutions that deliver wider benefits to the community beyond the key sort of factors that we are measuring our performance against.
So let's talk about solutions. You've started to a little bit, which is brilliant. So tell me a little bit about what you're doing to address some of those big challenges that James and Steve talked about.
So I think there are 3 key things that we are doing. The first thing is we're making our data available. So we are publishing on our website information on when our combined sewer overflows are storming. So when they are releasing untreated, partially treated sewage into the river. This can help our customers and stakeholders make informed choices about when to go into the river. The second thing we're doing is we're investing money to improve 250 of our sewage treatment works, making them more resilient to extreme weather and power outages and enabling them to treat greater flows of wastewater. And the third thing we're doing is we are key partners in the delivering of the Thames Tideway Tunnel super sewer. This is a £4.5 billion project consisting of a 25-kilometre tunnel running under east-west London, and this will make a transformational change to the water quality in the Thames, capturing 95% of the volume of untreated sewage currently entering the tidal Thames in a typical year.
Okay, so some big investment coming is what it sounds like to try and resolve some of those things. And you started to talk a little bit about event duration monitoring and the fact that that sort of near real-time data is available on your website. One thing that struck me was Steve's, I guess, maybe surprise at not knowing what was going on in the river. And I'm interested in whether you should be sharing more with customers about what's happening in the river, or what are your views on how much should customers be aware of, what are you sharing, given that you talked about being really transparent at the start of the interview?
I think the key challenge is we are not a voice for public health. We can only contribute our data towards helping the public understand the relative risks of bathing in sections of the river. We publish the data so people can make informed choices, but really that requires someone like the Department of Health or the DEFRA or Environment Agency to also be helping the public understand the risks from data that they hold.
Okay, so you've talked a little bit about some really big investment over the next 5 years and beyond, really. Of all of the things that Thames are going to be doing, what do you think offers the most scope to make the fastest progress on the challenges that James and Steve have talked about?
I'm afraid that I don't think there are any quick fixes. Ultimately, the investment we're making in our networks and in our sewage treatment works are considerable, and they take a long time to plan, deliver, commission and enact the benefits from. Perhaps some of the quickest changes maybe could come in customer behaviour changes. So 32% of blockages in our network derive from people flushing things down the toilet that really shouldn't go that way. Many of those blockages lead to escapes of sewerage that then enters the environment. We need to be working with our customers to help them understand and empowering them to take action to reduce some of the impact that they can have. I think another thing that we can do is ask our customers to report any signs of pollution to us more quickly. We've made sure that this is a more simplified process, because the sooner we can get to a pollution and we can constrict its cause, the less impact that will have on the environment. And I think the third thing we can do is also ask our customers to be aware of things like misconnections. So in areas where we have a separate sewer system and we see people connecting, perhaps completely obliviously, their foul water into a surface water drainage system. That causes us real problems, because it means untreated waste goes directly into a river. And the other way around is also a problem, where people connect their surface water, so they say the drainage from their extension or conservatory into the foul water sewer, means that more water reaches our sewage treatment works, and we are effectively having to treat rainwater, and that puts incredible pressure on the works, particularly exemplified by the very wet winter we've just had.
Do you think there's more that we could do to talk to customers and to help them understand some of the things you've just talked about? So I would imagine, misconnections, if you work in the water sector, makes sense. People understand that. But if I'm building an extension or paving over my drive, for example, do you think customers understand enough about the potential consequences of those choices that they might make?
Probably not, but I think there is more than we can do. So we have very extensive outreach programs that aim to raise awareness on particularly the issue of sewer abuse. So we have a program called BIDBI, Bin It, Don't Block It, and we are able we've got 19,000 what are called sewer detection monitors in our network, and they are there to detect when we have unusually high flows in our sewers that don't correlate to the morning or evening rush or the particularly wet winter, and they tell us where we're likely to have a blockage. And we use information from those 19,000 monitors to then go to particular neighbourhoods where we've got high propensity of blockages, and we engage with local communities and residents there to say, are you aware that we're experiencing high levels of blockage in your area? This is likely to be because people are flushing down things that shouldn't be going down their toilets and sinks. This is the impact it has. So we have an active outreach programme on that. We're also working with the Mayor of London and the London boroughs to try and raise awareness of the impact of what we call urban creep, the loss of green permeable spaces that causes additional runoff that then enters our sewers and causes flooding and the escape of sewage. So again, it's about trying to make the individual oblivious action conscious so people are aware of the impact that they are individually and collectively having.
I think actually for me anyway, at this point in time, people are more engaged than they probably ever have been about the health of rivers. So I think the challenge is then joining the dots, isn't it, between, as you talk about, those individual actions and actually the impact that they could potentially have, both kind of positive and negative. And that probably takes me on to my next question really, Alex. So are there any unintended consequences, do you think, of this very rapid focus on reducing spills from storm overflows?
I think the greatest unintended consequence potentially is going to be an increase in bills. We've been asked to do a lot more than we've ever done before, so not stuff that we funded for, and that is going to have an impact on customer bills. We've worked very hard in our price review for 2024 to make sure that we are balancing affordability, deliverability and impact. But as I said, we are being asked to do more than we've ever done before with systems that need further investment, and that is inevitably going to cause bills to rise. That's the biggest challenge. How do we make sure we make sufficient progress at a rate that we can afford and that our customers can afford?
And if there's one message that you'd want listeners to take away from a sort of Thames Water perspective, what would that be?
I think the key message is that we can only achieve the level of change we need by working together. We don't hold all the cards, but we are very keen to lean into sustaining greater change, but we need others to come to the table. Only by co-creating and co-delivering solutions will we get the rate and depth of change that we all seek.
And that probably takes me on to my final question, and I imagine you know what's coming. So I offer all my guests the Planet Possible magic wand. Give it a wave, Alex. What do you want to make possible?
So with a wave of my magic wand, I would like us all to get around the table more frequently and have more in-depth discussions about what we can do collectively to improve the environment and deliver the change that people urgently want.
Okay, Al. So there was a lot there. We had some pretty strong views alongside some areas of really clear alignment, which I thought was great. What were your big takeaways?
Three things really stood out. The first was around science and the responsibility for science and how it's used, how it's presented. I think if we look at the context of Henley, I mean, it's very timely. Henley Regatta is going on this week. River Action put some data out about Henley. Thames have put data out about the water quality in Henley. And they've got markedly different perspectives on what the data is, what it looks like, and also on where the testing locations are. Alex mentioned a single source of truth. We need a kind of a river champion, an independent river champion, and the Environment Agency was mentioned possibly in this context. We need to be able to use citizen science data in the future to enrich that picture. We also need to be able to trust the data that water companies put forward. And so we do need this independent authority that tells us what state our rivers are in. We kind of have a feel for that, but we clearly don't have the fully accurate picture. And Stephen James flagged some really big numbers that says something is really quite wrong and needs looking into. And so we need this authority to really oversee that process. The second thing I think was around transparency. Now, one of the things that Alex mentioned was an area that the quickest progress could be made in relation to some of these problems is in the area of public behaviours. The challenge with all of that is, of course, the media picture and the campaigner picture of Thames Water is they are not trusted. The public do not have confidence in the way that they're run at the moment. I don't know. I'm not qualified to say where exactly the balance is on that scale. But, campaigners talk about the amount of dividends that are paid out. Alex said that no dividends have been paid out externally since 2017. I am pretty convinced that the ownership structure that Thames currently has does not encourage that public confidence in their behaviours. And so I think there's an awful lot that can be done to increase the amount of transparency, both in terms of kind of things like water quality data, but also where and how the money is flowing and why, in order to build back that public confidence in what's going on. That way, some of these measures that are going to be asked of public, they stand a much greater chance of actually sticking. The third thing that really, really shone out was around getting water companies and campaigners around the table together to discuss solutions. Both parties mentioned this. It's certainly something that Thames have said. They made the point very strongly, but also have been saying it in recent weeks in industry conferences. So I think, my message there is, right, okay, put your money where your mouth is. This really needs to be done at the top level of management. Get round the table, start understanding each other's pressures, concerns and challenges, and work out where we want to go and how. And I think that was a really, really big one for me as well.
I really reflected on that as well from listening to all three of our guests. It was really powerful and it was nice to hear a point of real agreement. The other thing that I took away, I think, was it's about the health of the river, and that's not just about the water sector. And all three of our guests talked about that and talked about the wider role. So environmentally, had you got a kind of reflection on the health of our rivers more broadly from listening to both interviews, Al?
Both parties talked about the balance between what is a water company contribution to water quality impact, how much might come from agriculture and urban sources and so on. The fact is, we've got an idea, but it's not a particularly accurate one probably. There's only limited sampling points to create that picture. We need that picture to become much clearer in future. But I think the fundamental system controller, if you will, that has all of the ability to pull the right levers, push the right buttons to get things in the right place is the next government. And that's why this is just such critical timing here. My big fear at the moment is that the next government is going to really want to push ahead with economic growth, with development, with housing delivery and that kind of thing. And it's all going to be all about pace, rather than doing things well and doing things sustainably and managing the impacts on the water environment from all of these activities, from development, from agriculture and so on. We can do it right. We can do it sustainably. It is entirely possible. Alex was talking about myth busting. I want to bust that myth that you can't have rapid development that's sustainable. We know how to do it. We know how it has to be done in this country. There's an awful lot of pressure on our water environment. We're a small island with a big population density. We've just got to get this right. We've run out of time. The next 5 years is absolutely critical. That's my big call on the next government.
I like the fact that we finished off with a bit of passion too. That's great. And I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. Sustainable growth is key, isn't it? Brilliant. Thank you. As ever, time has flown by and we're here at the end of another episode of Planet Possible. So a thank you for joining us. I hope you found the conversation insightful. I hope it's given you something to think about in your world. Subscribe to the pod on your usual podcast player to make sure you never miss an episode. And we'd love to hear your ratings and reviews too. We've got even more fantastic guests and topics lined up for the rest of this year. So I really hope you'll join us for those. All that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to my superb guests, Steve Backshall, James Wallace, Alex Nickson, and my co-host, Alastair Chisholm. Thanks, Al.
Thank you.
That's it, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.